Question 9. More translating between C and RISC-V. Translate between the RISC-V code to C. What is the RISC-V code function computing? First thing we're going to do is we're going to add I x0 1 into t0. So what this is doing, it's setting t0 equal to 1. Then in the loop, we check if a1, our first argument, is equal to x0. If it is, then it's done. So that means as long as a1 is not equal to 0, we're going to keep on looping. Then the first thing we're going to do is we're going to multiply t0 by a0 and put that into t0. So we're going to do t0 is equal to t0 times a0, which is a0 is our 0th argument. We have two arguments, a0 and a1. And then we're going to add a1, -1, and a1. So that means we're decrementing a1. a1 is equal to a1 minus 1. And then we're going to jump and link to the loop again. So then at this point, a1 will be 1 less than it was before. So we're going to be multiplying a0 by itself for as many times as how big a1 is. Then when we finish, we're going to put t0 into a0 because we're adding t0 to 0 and we're putting that into a0. So then a0 is going to be equal to t0 and then we're returning. So if we use some real numbers for our arguments, we can see that this is actually the power function. So if we set a0 is equal to 5 and a1 is equal to 3, the first thing it does is it checks if a1 is equal to 0. At this point, 3 is not equal to 0. So then we're going to set t0 is equal to t0 times 5, which is equal to 5. And then we're going to decrement a1. So a1 is now 2. And then we're going to loop. Then we check is 2 equal to 0? It's not. So we now at this point, t0 is going to be equal to 5 times 5, which is equal to 25. And then we decrement a1. So a1 is now 1. We loop again, and then we check if a1 is equal to 0. a1 is not equal to 0, so we continue with the loop. Then we set t0 is equal to 25 times 5, because we do t0 is equal to t0 times a0. And then we decrement a1 again to be 0. Then we go back to the beginning of the loop. And we check if a1 is equal to 0. It is equal to 0, so that means we end. And then at the ending point, we're setting a0 equal to 125. And then you can see that this function is computing 5 to the power of 3. So it's the power function. So let's write that in C with sort of almost direct translation. We can see that a0 is x, a1 is y, and t0 is result. So we're going to create the function. We can call it power. And we have two inputs, int x and int y. So the first thing they tell us t0 is result. So we're going to set result equal to 1. Because over here they're setting t0 equal to 1. Next we have a while loop. So while the condition we check a1 is not equal to 0. So while y does not equal to 0, then we're going to do t0 is equal to t0 times a0. So this means result is equal to result times a0, which is x. And then we're going to decrement y, which is a1. So y minus minus, and then we repeat the loop. And then at the end, we're returning the result. Thank you.